For those listening, welcome to another reading. This is part two of Burning Down the American Plantation, a call for a revolutionary abolitionist movement. And we're going to start on a chapter called What We're Working Towards. Building the revolutionary forces capable of competently engaging in this conflict requires firm grounding in emancipatory political objectives and an understanding of the necessity for militant self defense. These two components are the preconditions for the expansion of the abolitionist struggle. The formation of political bodies capable of maintaining cohesion and expansion is paramount, as is the realization that militant actions must be prepared concurrently with and be supplementary to larger political aims. To rise beyond the limits of protest, we must chart out our political intentions, organizational goals, and a larger vision about our direction. First and foremost, militant self defense and the capacity for larger militant actions must be addressed at the inception of the organizing process. While we must defend people from captivity as well as our political centers, we must also be astute enough to realize that we cannot be on the defense indefinitely. The state is in a weaker position today than it has been in decades. And since the moment we go into action is up to us, the government invariably remains in a defensive position. We can act when we choose, and we should act wisely. Through our actions to liberate those preyed on by the state, our political support will increase. More importantly, our ethical foundation to purpose and create a new and better life will become increasingly more profound. As each participant joins the struggle, their involvement helps defeat the cage of instrumentalization roles, while at the same time, through their participation, the battle against the state is spread throughout society. The more long term considerations that are embedded from the beginning, the better our chances will be at turning the resistance into a revolution. If they are set up in a well considered manner, with new social functions built into their foundations, these networks of resistance can become the communes and councils capable of carving away at state power. The Rojava Revolution provides us with some exemplary attributes that help shape our movement and allow us to trace out the necessary elements of a liberated society. Shared political aspirations are paramount for our success, and we propose that the political framework articulated below should become the driving force behind our actions. As we fight for the abolition of the state and the abolition of slavery, we must still maintain fluidity and adapt to the current circumstances, but also retain this larger political purpose. Our political vision: 1. Self defense, the heart of revolutionary transformation. 2. Primary unit of self governance, the neighborhood council. 3. Conflict resolution and revolutionary justice. 4. Towards the abolition of gender. 5. Ownership through use, the cooperative economy, and expropriation. This next section is called Self Defense, the Heart of Revolutionary Transformation. Societies have always adapted and changed in order to defend themselves against attack. However, with the emergence of the nation state, self defense has become part of the monopoly of the state. This monopoly of self defense includes both military and society. The state has taken on the responsibility of defending its citizens against famine, sickness, poverty, and war, but often fails in these duties. Even worse, the state itself is often the main perpetrator of violence against its citizens. That was a quote. The legacy of militant struggle in Americas. Self-defense is the central pillar of our resistance. The state tries to consolidate its monopoly on violence by claiming to have the unique ability to protect its quote-unquote citizens. but it has become clear there is no such thing as protection that one does not provide oneself. Self defense is not only the barricade against an oppressive force, but also the means for the collective development that is an integral part of revolutionary change. From the bloody inception of the American state, every attempt to subject people under its hegemonic rule has been met with fierce resistance. From the early legacy of indigenous resistance and slave rebellions to later eruptions at Wounded Knee to the rise of the BLA, the drive for liberation has been the central desire of the oppressed. Maroon societies in the U.S. South were autonomous communities of indigenous people, self-freed slaves, and poor whites. They were collective and uncompromisingly committed to defending each other's freedom from slave catchers and bosses. Maroon societies in the South were autonomous communities of indigenous people, self-freed slaves, and poor whites. They were collective and uncompromisingly committed to defending each other's freedom from slave catchers and bosses. The Maroon communities prevented anyone from going without food and protection, and to ensure this, they conducted risky incursions into surrounding areas. Due to the relentless attacks from the government and the planter class, they relied on a fierce backbone of armed defense to maintain their autonomy. Cooperation with nearby Maroon communities allowed multiple teams to join together against bigger enemies to create a fluid and powerful fighting force. It was this very decentralized nature of militias that ensured their autonomy, as well as gave them fighting prowess against a bigger enemy. In fact, during the Civil War, they used the same hit and run tactics against the Confederate Army and the plantations. While the Maroons demonstrate the usefulness of localized self-defense of an autonomous region, the resistance in Haiti during the revolution shows the benefits of building a decentralized fighting force from within an imperial society. The history of the resistance consisted of debilitating switchbacks between the two formations that Russell Maroon Schultz refers to as the Hydra and the Dragon. When the decentralized forces, the Hydra, were unleashed, the resistance enjoyed military success. When a leader centralized the militia and grabbed power, the Dragon, they would either be executed by the slavers or imperialists, or, as occurred in the years later, killed by their own people's resistance due to their despot behavior. What is perhaps the most recent example of successful autonomous resistance to the state in the American context was the Black Liberation Army in the early 1970s. Their version of the Maroon was an underground network, allowing them to use offensive tactics that prevent infiltration. At their height, they skillfully liberated numerous captive insurgents from state bondage. Against a hegemonic enemy, camouflage was essential. The longer fighters maintained their anonymity, the longer they were able to sustain attacks without taking crippling casualties. If the Black Liberation Army had been thoroughly tied to a political body before going underground, the political movement in general could have recruited new members through an above-ground organization. By linking such a group with public, council-based organizations founded on liberatory practices, the movement can be built through simultaneously constructing a new way of life and enacting revolutionary justice. Moreover, the underground model ought to be combined with a visible above-ground network that delivers both tactical and strategic advantages. The revolutionaries can attract wider community support without forfeiting the benefit of underground organization. The Anti-Racist Action Network in the US in the 80s carried on the legacy of fighting fascism through a decentralized, militant, above-ground network. Its chapters were grounded locally with local, anonymous participants driving its activities on the streets. Anti-fascist tactics, focused primarily around the use of physical force, proved effective in forcing neo-Nazi groups out of entire neighborhoods. The tactics were simple. If they came upon a neo-Nazi, they would use sufficient force to drive them away. The network was so successful that it eventually grew to 100 chapters. By joining in a nationwide network, they were able to help spread and strengthen the model while still maintaining local control over each chapter. This model shows the effectiveness of decentralized, locally based activity reinforced by connective networks across the larger region. Self defense in a revolutionary society. Successful self defense must incorporate revolutionary values and practices. In Rojava, combatants are trained both in fighting techniques and the benefits of creating a feminist, egalitarian society. They put these values into effect through their relationships. For example, to dismantle the lingering effects of patriarchy, no man can give a woman an order. To maintain participation and egalitarian relationships, all fighters contribute to decision making within units, particularly by selecting their own leaders for specific missions. Relationships between comrades, born from their own liberation and participation in a bottom up system, allows them to be very effective militarily. This is hardly surprising, as fighters who believe deeply in the liberatory society they are fighting for, as well as have a profound trust in those around them, are more likely to consistently advance the struggle forward. This strength sustains the integrity of the revolution against its enemies. Through this conscientious method, they have built a 50,000 strong militia that has proven to be the most effective force against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. The training of these new militants is the revolutionary heart of the Rojava Revolution. The long term intentions of the training programs are to ensure that everyone can participate in self defense. To that extent, there are also localized training programs that arm the public for a second tier of neighborhood defense. The Self Defense Forces, HPC, were formed for this purpose, while specific armed groups such as the People's Protection Units have been formed to fight external enemies. The HPC are civilians that get arms training with the specific goal of maintaining autonomy against internal forces that might seek to consolidate power. They are volunteers who receive both political education and self defense training. These armed groups are able to defend their communities from attacks without compromising revolutionary values. As the YPG and YPJ liberate ISIS territory, new communities become incorporated into their political project. Rather than establish a top down system of governance, the revolutionary movement establishes new neighborhood councils and communes, feminist education programs, and decentralized local based militias within each liberated town. To implement this form of political organization, there is undoubtedly a give and take. While the towns receive the infrastructure necessary for self governance, such as weapons and training from the YPG to set up their own local defense group, they agree to uphold certain social principles like feminism and social ecology. Due to the egalitarian political organization and the relationship engendered through the process, the Rojava Revolution has not only defended its decentralized political system, but has even expanded the council system to neighboring regions. The core tenets of Rojava's self defense project are as follows. Defense is integral to the growth of the revolutionary movement. Militias operate according to liberatory political principles. Within militia units, decision making is participatory, led from the bottom up, and leaders are elected during missions. Self defense training is provided to anybody who desires it. This next section is called Enhancing Our Struggle. Across the United States, there are currently groups that are committed to the principles of self defense, from left wing armed groups to anti fascist brigades to cop watch organizations. These groups use a variety of tactics and strategies depending on the local conditions, yet they share common enemies: fascists, right wing militias, and state forces. The groups who have combated these reactionaries have a proven commitment to defend oppressed communities. They are the foundation upon which we can build a political movement. Thus, we propose that the existing militant anti fascist and anti police movement can be further developed according to the following guidelines. underscoring these groups with the new revolutionary scope and the political principles outlined here, deepening the local scope of these groups by tying the actions to neighborhood self governance and a larger political project, connecting these projects to each other to broaden our capacity by increasing resources, participants, and deepening our commitments to revolutionary political solutions, developing the capacity to begin launching offensive actions against fascists and the regime. Our proposal is to grow locally while connecting politically and materially to similar groups regionally. By placing self defense at the center of our revolutionary movement, we can protect the development of our political projects and centers. This will allow the values and practices that we are trying to implement to have the opportunity to expand. We propose connecting self defense groups to the smallest unit of self governance possible, the neighborhood. This places the capacity for self defense in the hands of those who need it. To summarize, we argue decentralization is an effective militant strategy and shapes the revolutionary practice of defense groups. Militant groups are connected to local political bodies organizing towards self governance. Feminism, anti racism, and the abolition of white supremacy constitute the foundation of defense organizations. Core revolutionary principles and goals allow groups to work with a variety of tactics towards the same goal, even without direct coordination. This next section is called the Neighborhood Council, Primary Unit of Self Governance, Building Towards a Council System. When revolutionary groups form projects like the Black Panthers breakfast programs, the New Orleans based Common Ground Collective, or the Greek anarchist revolutionary solidarity with Syrian refugees, these initiatives also form new political and social relations based on mutual aid and neighborhood self sufficiency. Unlike state based organizations, which turn citizens into helpless recipients of services, volunteer run projects instead supply the resources, tools, and knowledge for people to provide for themselves, make the primary decisions about organization, and if firmly, let me read that again, and tied to self defense forces, eventually take over the infrastructure necessary for survival. For example, revolutionary anarchist groups in Athens have been working with refugees from the Syrian civil war. The refugees are routinely attacked by fascists and often denied housing, food, and healthcare. Anarchist groups have taken over abandoned hotels and have invited refugees to live in them. However, instead of remaining dependent and trapped in a charity based relationship, the refugees have organized themselves in conjunction with anarchists according to a council model and now have regular meetings to preside over the allocation of resources to solve their problems communally. Above all, the Spanish Civil War provides a hallmark example of how emancipatory political principles can be introduced alongside active experimentation with new and innovative forms of self organization. While conducting the military struggle on the front, militants in the rearguard helped form workers' councils and rural communes, and since anarchists were at the forefront of the struggle, the council based system was remarkably egalitarian. Workers seized factories, peasants collectivized the land, and even the revolutionary militias were organized in a participatory and non hierarchical fashion as a result of the anarchist struggle. Indeed, the revolutionary militias were formed in a similarly horizontal manner as the collectives, which reciprocally provided them with both weapons and other provisions. The symbiotic relationship between the workers' councils, collectivized land projects, and horizontal militias demonstrates how the political foundation facilitated cooperation between each of the three organizational structures. The council system upholds the foundational principles of any resistance movement and sustains the decentralization of power. Importantly, these bodies are directly connected to and have sole jurisdiction over their territory, neighborhood, or town. As the council expands horizontally, its decision making can be diversified by subdividing into local groups based on specific issues, such as tenant councils, youth groups, and neighborhood defense units. The implementation of this strategy should therefore strive for the three objectives outlined below. Revolutionary groups can help found councils grounded in strong political principles. The council expands horizontally to new councils and collectives. Strengthening connections between councils helps reinforce each one and builds up pragmatic resources and defense. This next section is called the council system in a revolutionary society. In Rojava, the neighborhood council is the smallest, most local, and yet most powerful unit of self governance. The council itself is not a bureaucratic institution. Instead, it is shaped by the people who participate in it. Neighbors meet here to engage in the most immediate form of politics, debating issues, distributing resources, and making decisions. Council members reach solutions to their problems through the active participation. To further empower its members, each council is also subdivided into particular committees based on specific issues. These groups then become the primary actors on issues pertaining to their lives. Since the council systems allow for equal participation on the most local level of society, each participant, regardless of identity, age, ethnicity, etc., is able to directly affect the conditions of their life. Working with the neighbor when one's life depends on it creates a fertile ground for trust and mutual concern to grow. When neighbors survive due to their mutual support and cooperation with each other, they are more likely to recognize one another on a human level and care for each other as individuals. The baseless divisions fabricated by the state and perpetuated by the myth of scarcity have no basis here. The process of being politically engaged through the council repels the conditions that result in bigotry, mistrust, and competition by instead fostering relationships based on understanding. The decision making capacity of neighbors in this council system allows people to build autonomous institutions like learning centers, health clinics, and other facilities based on local needs. An example from the autonomous Zapatistas region, a precursor to and inspiration for Rojava, illustrates how this process functions. The construction of a hospital in a Zapatista community is a good example of a project developed through the council. Its formation was based on years of conservation between health providers and the people they care for. Due to this dialogue, the resulting hospital reflected the needs of the people in the area. For example, the medicine practiced there ended up being a mixture of local healing arts and traditional Western medicine. Health promoters volunteer their time and are supported by the surrounding families, allowing greater focus on people's care instead of working for money. The hospital's quality is affirmed by the fact that it is not only used by people in the nearby community, but villagers all around the region. By imbuing each council with decision making power, the distribution of governance becomes decentralized, and people across a large territory become empowered through the relationships that are forged and the ability to genuinely determine their own living conditions. For instance, returning to the example currently unfolding in Rojava, it has been collectively mandated that no other council or regional body is allowed to override its decisions, making the local council become the most powerful unit. The core of these revolutionary bodies are built through the minutiae of day to day interactions and through the individual realization that when a person has overthrown oppression in the most intimate fashion and now lives in a self actualized life, a return to conventional day to day despotism will not occur without a fight. This next section is called Towards Our Struggle. The political paradigm we are working towards is a network of councils and communes without the state. It's a vision of autonomy that runs through neighborhood based councils where decision making rests at the local level. This political formation reverses hierarchy and centralized power by making the most local unit the most powerful, and regional bodies simply a means for coordination. We propose starting from the nexus of the small revolutionary groups already active in many cities, towns, and rural areas. Already, such groups function as local political collectives with strong ethical backbones and a commitment to communal decision making. As these groups expand through the abolitionist struggle, they have the ability to introduce more people to this model of politics. The purpose, then, is to expand qualitatively and quantitatively throughout recreating centralized and hierarchical social formations. To facilitate the process of liberating people from bondage, we offer the following suggestions as possible means by which revolutionary groups can help establish structurally decentralized projects that integrate uncompromising anarchist foundations through the creation of new councils and local institutions. Revolutionary groups can create social programs such as a free health clinic, safe houses for immigrants and other targeted by the state, educational programs, etc., with a revolutionary outlook in order to bring new people into revolutionary methods of organization while building localized resources. They can help form new collectives and councils based on either local circumstances or a specific issue, such as tenants associations, revolutionary youth groups, or neighborhood assemblies. Revolutionary groups can build stronger relationships with similar groups in other cities. The success of this project is measured by more and more people within the neighborhood becoming politically engaged and active decision makers within their communities. While the state drags on by using increasingly totalitarian methods, we build our power, building new communities of resistance in the disintegrating remains of the regime. By proliferating these bodies can, in the short term, erode the oppressive functions of the state and partnered with rigorous defense, dislodge them. This section is called Conflict Resolution and Revolutionary Justice. Revolutionary Justice. The legacy of revolutionary justice in the U.S. is an inherently political phenomenon, as it has always been situated in reprisals against the state, the slaveholding planter class, capitalists and their institutions, and the broader forces of bondage, from colonial to patriarchal oppression. It is impossible to speak about resolving social conflicts in the US without addressing the agents of the state and reactionary racist forces and their consistent use of terror to maintain their social and political position. Revolutionary justice may just as easily be called self defense. In fact, the oppressed are often left with no other option, given the brutal, methodical, and continued nature of their subjugation. Their only choice for survival is to strike back. This distinct mode of defensive attack is epitomized in the legacy of Nat Turner and John Brown. After rallying a formidable group of rebels, Nat Turner's armed formation went from plantation to plantation, killing plantation owners and freeing slaves. With his militant band of abolitionists, John Brown put up a valiant armed resistance to pro slavery militias in Kansas before launching his famous assault on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, from which he intended to get weapons to distribute to slaves for their rebellion. These actions were selfless attempts to free people and were conducted explicitly on the side of the oppressed. The profound level of violence universally used by the slaveholders meant that only an equivalent level of violence would suffice for liberation. Revolutionary justice was administered in a more organized fashion by Maroon communities in their targeted attacks on the planter class. For example, the Maroon called the Great Dismal Swamp became the epicenter of slave emancipation. Some 2,000 fugitives fled to the swamp, including debt fugitives, slaves, and refugees from the brutal wars on the indigenous populations, creating autonomous communities of resistance. The Maroon societies were not satisfied with just their own liberty. They rose up to fight for others as well. Their numbers grew as they attacked plantations and liberated slaves. Their original attacks took place in the regions bordering the swamp. However, as intercepted communications show, the Maroon communities intended to attack entire towns to destroy the system of power that sustained the slave system. Every prison uprising from Attica to Lucasville is an example of revolutionary justice. Every group that goes underground to launch clandestine attacks against bondage and oppression, like the Black Liberation Army or the United Freedom Front, engages in acts of revolutionary justice. The uprisings of the 1960s in Watts, Newark, and Detroit to the Los Angeles riots, and the recent insurrections in Ferguson and Baltimore, sparked by executions from the police, are manifestations of revolutionary justice. No platform, no dialogue, no interterritory, and certainly no concern can be ceded to those who either threaten or unleash authoritarian white supremacist violence. As the Italian anarchist Alfredo Bonanno, I know I mispronounced that, has eloquently put it, the life of someone who oppresses others and prevents them from living is not worth a cent. When a person chafes under the subjugation of violent oppression and breaks away from it, whether as part of a revolutionary group, an organized society, or simply as a lone actor, this is an act of revolutionary justice. The methods of this justice are a far cry from the methods we reserve for those within our revolutionary groups and our own communities. This line is clearly demarcated by the divisions between the oppressed versus the oppressor. For the oppressor, we have nothing but antagonism and struggle. For the oppressed, we have nothing but understanding and compassion. This next section is called Conflict Resolution in a Revolutionary Society. The entire council-based system, as in Spain, Chiapas, or Rojava, is predicated on the health of the social fabric. All pragmatics, education, and values are collectively organized so that the individual can overcome alienation and powerlessness by personally shaping the conditions of their life through discussion and decision making. The ability to shape all the facets of society confer upon each individual a far wider scope than the mere satisfaction of personal needs, as it also includes the well being of the entire community. With the invisible wall between politics and community broken down, this focus on community health becomes the driving force behind the process of resolving conflicts. If we intend to resolve the conflicts between parties instead of simply finding fault and applying punishment, the solution is mediation. In Rojava, conflict resolution is implemented in several slightly different ways throughout the society that the participants are actively involved in constructing. The tech mill. The tech mill is a foundational process that begins with self reflection and analysis based on revolutionary principles. In fact, it's important to note that this practice is what led to this region's transition from a hierarchical national liberation struggle to its current ground up structure. The tech mill is implemented in all organizations from the YPJ/YPG militias to all revolutionary organs in civil society. The main point is that each person criticizes those that they care the most about because they want to see them improve and become better people. Hmm. If they're speaking about someone else, that person cannot reply to their criticism. In fact, they are not even supposed to bring it up after the tech mill. They are just supposed to accept it and think about it. Once no one has anything else to say, the person leading the tech mill summarizes what was stated. For the newly enlisted, there is a general tech mill held every 3 days in addition to a session conducted after every military training and political education class. This allows the potential for hierarchy between the trainers and trainees to stop from forming, as trainees are constantly given the opportunity to criticize them and their approaches to instruction. In addition to summarizing their observations of what occurred during the tech mill, the trainers also conclude by stating how they can make certain desired changes and improvements. This is intended to be a harmonizing process, a reminder of what the revolutionary horizon is and how everyone can work on themselves to stay on point. The Peace and Consensus Committee. In Rojava, conflict resolution is handled in a bottom up manner and integrated into daily life as opposed to exclusively institutional settings. At the level of the neighborhood, participation in a commune or committees is already a preventative measure. People generally are already invested in the well being of their counterparts due to the process of working through social issues locally. When a conflict occurs, people are more invested in finding a solution due to the organizational process. The more developed the revolutionary project becomes, then the more successful conflict resolution will become. The Peace and Consensus Committee is composed of a few neighbors who are invested in finding a reasonable outcome to conflicts. The office, quote unquote, where they meet is a neighbor's house. The family might be at home, other neighbors might pop in, and in the middle of this familiar environment, the participants talk over the issue they are trying to resolve. According to Erkan Boga, the goal of peace and consensus committees is not to condemn one or both sides in a proceeding, but rather to achieve a consensus between the conflicting parties. If possible, the accused is not ostracized through a punishment or locked away, but rather is made to understand that his or her behavior has led to injustice, damage, and injury. If necessary, the matter is discussed for a long time. Reaching consensus among the parties is a result that will lead to a more lasting peace. This means that every party must be committed to enacting the solution rather than merely agreeing heartlessly to it, or worse, being bureaucratically and indifferently coerced into compliance. This section is called Work of the Council. Another good example of how these methods work is in the councils of Bakır, or southeastern Turkey, which preceded the revolution in Rojava. Here, there is a dual power situation. Revolutionary councils exist even though the state has not been abolished. Quote, when we talk about judicial matters, you have to understand that we're trying to organize a society without a state. Many people who have legal disputes or other problems that need solving don't go to the Turkish courts anymore. They come to the city councils. End quote. Council members will sit down with people in the midst of a crisis and talk it through with them. According to one council member, quote, we work with conversation, dialogue, negotiation, and when necessary, criticism and self-criticism. When someone does something wrong, the party who perpetuated the harm has to make it up to the people he injured. There's no death penalty. We don't put perpetrators in prison or penalize them financially. End quote. Even in cases as serious as murder, the solution is to help the perpetrator develop into a better person using the help of psychologists or others. End quote. There is an extraordinary precedent set by this situation. A council member's priority is not a bureaucratic process of instituting law, but instead personally working with those who need it. The exact format and process of such solutions vary, as they should, depending on the needs or relationships of each neighborhood. What they have in common is that those who will be affected by the decisions are always the ones who propel the process, and there is a wholehearted commitment to mending the social fabric rather than punishment. How conflict resolution works. 1. Social cohesion, not punishment, is the intended result. 2. The process must be Let me read that over. The process must be predicated on the personal development of those involved. 3. The people affected by the decisions drive the process, and all parties must agree with the resolution. 4. Conflict resolution works best when coupled with strong, continuous relationships between participants. And lastly, liberatory political principles must be the criteria for all resolutions. This next section is called Towards Our Struggle. Revolutionary justice is an unpredictable yet inevitable element in revolutionary struggle. As we move towards liberation, there will be spontaneous eruptions, moments to support and side with, as well as alliances to create. The more power tries to suppress the population, the more defiant the acts of revolutionary justice become. No one can bear an oppressive situation forever. Both the riot and the lone attack have recently become common. Both are expressions of a need for a radically different social arrangement, but neither has the capacity to deliver long term solutions. Like the rebellions of Nat Turner and John Brown, these can easily be subdued and crushed without infrastructure, support, and connections to revolutionary political movements. When police killed Mike Brown in Ferguson, the town erupted in riots. No sooner had they begun this act of defiance when nonprofits and faith quote unquote leaders descended upon the town to induce people to protest quote unquote peacefully and attempted to de escalate the situation. On the other hand, riot police and armed right wing militias surrounded the rebels, cornered them in a sea ille- of illegality by declaring curfews, and then swept people up with brutal arrest and long jail terms. Without revolutionary objectives or the foundations for a sustained revolutionary conflict, everyone had to eventually reconcile living with the oppressive state that they were just rebelling against when the riots subsided. The most essential tasks are to create the ideological underpinnings for revolt and the necessary infrastructure that can sustain action and long term forms of organization. There is a big difference materially in what an organized and fortified hamlet versus a mass and revolt can accomplish. With a base of operations impenetrable to outsiders, the Maroons were able to provide a serious challenge to the practitioners of slavery. Tactically, they leveraged the advantage of attack from a free area outside the jurisdiction of hegemonic power. However, it was not only their territorial integrity, but a commitment to the autonomous nature of their societies that allowed for the Maroons' perseverance. The Maroons refused to give up their freedoms, maintained regional decision making and fluid fighting formations, and continued traditional practices. Outsiders looking for liberation saw that the people involved in Maroon communities weren't struggling to grab power, but to fight for liberation itself. In this regard, an overarching political objective is also absolutely necessary. In order to go on the offensive, groups need a foundational reason to act, to liberate individuals, to liberate new territories, or to weaken the state. Revolutionary communities must exemplify the new socio political relationships that they seek to create in society at large. The Black Liberation Army articulated a compelling political perspective which made its actions legible to a broader community and situated revolutionary justice within a political tradition. Where the BLA was hampered by not having an above ground organization to bring people in, anarchist activity during the Spanish Civil War provides a great example of how a public organization combined with defense forces can better interrogate oppressed populations. After storming a barrack, anarchists freed all the prisoners. Political prisoners were locked up there and had been talking with other prisoners about the revolution. Many of these captives had already been radicalized by their abusive jailers and saw the ideas presented as a transformative option. Upon release, these newly politicized prisoners were ready to participate in the political model of their rescuers. Many of them joined the movement as part of the Iron Column, putting into practice revolutionary relationships and organization while fighting against oppressive forces. Their militia had a fluid and egalitarian nature, which was itself an active example of the organizational forms it fought for. Through this example, it is possible to see how building upon revolutionary relationships and political objectives can add weight and longevity to inevitable eruptions against oppressive forces. Were it not for the strength of the relationship between militia members, it would have been difficult for revolutionaries to face a powerful external enemy during the Spanish Civil War. Maintaining internal social cohesion and building revolutionary organization turned sporadic revolutionary justice into a comprehensive political force. By laying proper political frameworks, both in terms of practice and ideology, revolutionary groups today have the capacity to turn the tide of spontaneous revolt into something that can sustain itself. If successful, we will inspire others to acts of revolutionary justice and self liberation, initiating participation in building the political foundations for the future. The revolution will build the revolution. There are four important ways revolutionary groups can contribute to such movements. There are four important ways revolutionary groups can contribute to such moments. 1. Look to the communities that are most oppressed for comrades to struggle in. Read that over. 1. Look to the communities that are most oppressed for comrades in struggle. 2. Fight alongside and defend groups enacting revolutionary justice. 3. Derail forces that want to bring people back into the fold of power, nonprofits, political parties, and authoritarian political groups. Lastly, provide political foundation, principles, new organizational models, and infrastructure in defense. This next section is called Towards the Abolition of Gender. The patriarchal control and the relation of terror that engenders slavery and sets the conditions for modern political reality in the U.S. is truly exemplified in the social position of the female slave. The remarkably cruel degree of control exercised on Black women embodies the violence of the reproductive process that constitutes Black life. While patriarchal violence is a phenomenon that is ubiquitous when coupled with slave system, let me read that over. While patriarchal violence is a phenomenon that is ubiquitous when coupled with the slave system, the oppression becomes exceptionally totalizing and creates a uniquely so the formation of quote unquote man or quote unquote woman has a different meaning within this context. Motherhood, for instance, was crucial in reproducing property for slave society. Furthermore, parental rights were non existent. Children were sold and separated from families at will, and children were renamed to ensure patriarchal domination by the slave owner. Afro-pessimist author Saidiya Hartman argues, quote, the captive female does not possess gender as much as she is possessed by gender, that is, by way of a particular investment in and use of the body. What woman, in quotes, designates in the context of captivity is not to be escalated in terms of domesticity or protection, but in terms of the disavowed violence of slave law, the sanctity of property, and the necessity of absolute submission, the pathologizing of the Black body, the restriction of Black sentience, the multifarious use of property, and the precarious status of the slave within the public sphere. End quote. It is under this reign of terror that the category of women, in quotes, as it operates generally in the United States, was constructed on the basis of a total captivity of Black women. Gender roles in the U.S. are situated within this context. The normalization of the white family unit and its categories of woman and man can't be extricated from the ownership relation. If we desire to create a world where this fixated categorization is abolished, where heteronormativity is dismantled, and people can truly create themselves without the imposition of coercive and fabricated roles, then we must begin the struggle at the origin of the non-human human relation, the relations of terror, and the patriarchal relation of property. The patriarchal relation of property. The destruction of the gender binary and the liberation from patriarchal control then must be based off a politic of action, the foundational violence that established the human, non-human man slash woman or slave. Let me read that again. The destruction of the gender binary and the liberation from patriarchal control then must be based off a politic of action, the foundational violence that established the human, non-human, the man slash woman, or slave slash free dichotomies is constructed through the process of captivity and terror. We must destroy the means of captivity and political infrastructure that makes the reign of terror possible. By destroying the material means of captivity, we can begin reconfiguring the categorization of captive gender roles. We can begin this process through revolutionary organization and self-defense, which is crucial at this juncture. This section is called From Self-Emancipation to Organization. Emancipatory struggles that have the potential to overturn normative relations and open realms of social and political possibilities have customarily materialized from movements and revolutionary organizations that focused on destroying the mechanisms of captivity. Furthermore, the autonomous action of rebel women have often been tied into militant political projects that help expand the potential of feminist politics. There are numerous historical examples that indicate how the war against patriarchy in the United States has always been tied to the struggle against the slave system and its interconnected network of property relations. For instance, Harriet Tubman made gallant contributions to the early abolitionist struggle by liberating slaves from captivity and gained even greater success as her actions became tied into the larger struggle for liberation on a national scale. Her life exemplified the necessity of resistance and self defense. As working slave since 5 years old, she suffered greatly and witnessed the destruction of her family. Harriet Tubman's journey from bondage is the prototype of revolutionary action. She refused to stay in captivity any longer, exclaiming, "There was one of two things I had a right to do: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." End quote. Seeing no option except self defense, she escaped via the informal Underground Railroad network, then became one of its strongest participants, freeing her own family and 70 others over a decade. Tubman was always armed with a revolver for self defense during passage. Her work culminated in helping John Brown organize the Harper's Ferry assault, recruiting runaway slaves for the action, and attaining the name General Tubman in the process. Lastly, Tubman was the first woman to head an armed expedition during the Civil War, as she guided the raid at Combahee Ferry, which liberated 750 slaves. Tubman's escape from the plantation was crucial for her self liberation. This first step, not by patronage but by action, challenged not just patriarchal foundations of the slave system, but also helped escalate the war against the state by strengthening the underground network. When she took that step, she regained control of herself as a woman and as a human being, and in doing so, garnered the confidence to free others. With the remarkable degree of fortitude to overcome the mentality of one victimized by slave relations, she at one and the same time rejected bondage and patriarchy. The totalizing violence and dehumanization imposed through the slave system, overcome personally by Tubman and by the liberated slaves in general, marked a break from the human/non-human relation. Once liberated, she did not slip into the constrictive roles offered by quote unquote womanhood in quote free society. Her work threw into question gender roles themselves. As she traversed the Underground Railroad, her confidence inspired others to free themselves, and her actions culminated in her great raid at Combahee Ferry, where she demonstrated the revolutionary understanding that individual freedom necessitates the destruction of the system in its entirety and the freedom of all. Approximately a century after Tubman's courageous actions, Black Liberation Army combatant Assata Shakur continued the resistance struggle against captivity and slave society. Shakur had been an organizer with the Black Panther Party in New York City in the Harlem branch and actively participated in the larger Black liberation struggle. The state, in a brazen display of arrogance, attempted to pin every bank robbery or violent crime committed by a Black woman on Shakur. The intense repression of the Black liberation movement during COINTELPRO culminated for Shakur with the shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike, where her closest friend, Zaid Shakur, was killed, and she and her comrade, Sandia Akole, were detained. The cruel treatment Shakur had to endure in the hands of the state is emblematic. Let me read that again. The cruel treatment Shakur had to endure in the hands of the state is emblematic of the sheer barbarism of U.S. slave society. Shakur was initially housed in solitary confinement for 21 months and then moved to a maximum security facility that housed several white supremacists. Later, she was transferred to another facility where she was routinely brutalized. The state's intentions were obvious from the outset. They intended to punish her for fighting for general liberation and reaffirming its dominance through her subjugation. She personally observed the integral connection between bondage, race, and patriarchy. During her time in prison, she concluded, quote, "There are no criminals here at Rikers Island Correctional Institute for Women, New York, only victims. Most of the women, over 95%, are Black and Puerto Rican. Many were abused children. Most have been abused by men, and all have been abused by the system." End quote. Her BLA comrades organized her heroic escape from prison and, after a period of living underground, helped her escape to Cuba, where she still lives today. The U.S. government, in its long-standing commitment to Black captivity and white supremacy, has gone to extreme lengths to bring her back, placing a $2 million bounty on her head, put her on top of the list of most wanted terrorists, and pressured the Cuban government to extradite her to the U.S. Like Harriet Tubman, her path of escape and resistance began to change the narrative of resistant movements and of political reality. It is through this path of resistance and organization that we see these women recreate themselves and what liberation could look like for others. So when Shakur proclaims, quote, "I am a 20th century escaped slave," end quote, she reconstitutes the struggle for abolition to its original place in U.S. politics and the original incarceration of womanhood. She herself understood the necessity for total emancipation, saying, quote, "Women can never be free in a country that is not free. We can never be liberated in a country where the institutions that control our lives are oppressive, or while the American government and American capitalism remain intact." The fight for women's liberation, then, is acutely tied to the destruction of the patriarchal social relations that were established by the totalizing terror of slavery. The liberation of one woman is dependent on the liberation of all. So, if even one woman liberates herself from captivity, the potential for the destruction of the U.S. system is that much more likely. This explains the outrageous response to Shakur's liberation, and this is why the state cannot tolerate seeing its captives freed, particularly when they are freed on their own terms. Yet, the inverse is much more crucial, that as more women take it upon themselves to actively and militantly participate in their own emancipation, the destruction of the state becomes imminent. And with this demise, the carceral nature of gender roles begins to unravel. As Assata Shakur encourages us, quote, "Under the guidance of Harriet Tubman and Fannie Lou Hamer and all of our foremothers, let us rebuild a sense of community. Let us rebuild the culture of giving and carrying on the tradition of fierce determination to move on closer to freedom." End quote. This section is called Feminism in a Revolutionary Society. In other revolutionary periods around the world, we find organized forces that coalesced around feminist militancy. In many of these instances, organization took an expansive forms that led to both challenging gender normalization and unlocking revolutionary possibilities. During the Spanish Civil War, for example, the powerful female militia, mujeres, I'm going to read that again. During the Spanish Civil War, for example, the powerful female militia took up dual call of self-defense and self-emancipation. In their words, quote, "We did not want to substitute a feminist hierarchy for a masculine one. It's necessary to work, to struggle together, because if we don't, we'll never have a social revolution. But we needed our own organization to struggle for ourselves." End quote. They combine self-activity with direct action, putting into practice pragmatic steps for liberation and making revolution a reality. In addition to laying the political groundwork by building numerous organizational projects, from education to infrastructure, they provided support for women in the militias, setting up shooting ranges and target practice classes. The direct link between action, education, and new organizational forms allowed them to facilitate broad new social life, expanding to 30,000 members. By building new organizations based completely on a new social outlook, they were able to create a more functional, liberatory society. In Rojava, restructuring gender roles begins with how knowledge is produced. The political goal of their feminist education system is to overcome the hierarchy of knowledge and to change the nature of science and education. We aim to understand the mechanisms that lay at the basis of the dominance of men's language and of the exclusion of women from the history of this field by understanding the politics of power and the truth regimes. To counterbalance the truth regimes that reinforce patriarchal power, organizations realized what was needed was a study that originates from women's perspectives. This comes in the form of what the Kurdish freedom movement calls genealogy, which is essentially the remaking of social sciences from the female perspective. This is implemented pragmatically by a parity between women's and men's participation in social life. Across all aspects of life, from the councils to the militia, to civic roles to cooperatives, there is a women's only component to complement the same of men or mixed gender. To enter any of the armed groups, trainees must first receive education on revolutionary principles, especially genealogy, because patriarchy is so deeply rooted historically. Their solution is to not only seek parity for women, but to give women a higher footing. So while the armed group, the YPG, is all genders, the YPJ is female only. While engaged in militia activity, men are not allowed to give women orders in any circumstances. A house of women in each town gives training to men and women on women's rights and participates in advanced conflict mediation that pertain to women. The development of collectives is aided by, I'm not sure how to say this, so I'm just going to spell it ABORIY, Gen, specifically to help women's cooperatives get off the ground. As a result, women in Rojava have taken control of their lives in new ways, from healthcare to education to mediation, as well as three separate defense forces and an independent economic body. This system, practice of centering women, from remaking formative social sciences to creating a culture where women live with a higher degree of self direction and autonomous self defense, proved indispensable when armed units from the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria enslaved women who were on the periphery of Rojava's social revolution. In August 2014, ISIS attacked villages in the Sinjar region of Iraq, driving locals into the mountains. They bulldozed villages, captured thousands of women, forcing them into sex slavery, and slaughtered over 5,000. As the survivors taking refuge in Sinjar Mountain were surrounded by ISIS, they were abandoned by state military. It was the feminist forces of the YPG and the YPJ who took the initiative to fight ISIS back. Expanding on the liberatory organization in Rojava, the the Yazidis were assisted in establishing their own self defense forces and organs of self governance. Sex slaves rescued by feminist militias have become the fighters of the YJE, the Yazidi women units turning their dehumanization and victimhood into the pinnacle of resistance. The transformation through self defense led to the YJE and its mixed gender counterpart to retake ground from ISIS, including the city of Sanjar, less than a year after the genocide, and continuing to liberate their friends and families still in captivity. For the first time in our history, we take up arms because, with the last massacre, we understood that nobody will protect us. We must do it ourselves, end quote, proclaimed YJE fighter. The totalizing violence that almost engulfed Yazidi women in their entirety, condemning them to the slave relation previously discussed, was destroyed by and transformed into armed women's self defense. So, this is the end of the reading of part two. And just as I stated on part one, I'm not going to be giving a commentary, but I want to encourage others to engage with this text critically, to do further research, and to also come to your own analysis and conclusions. but to also challenge those conclusions and that analysis by talking with other people, whether it be your partners, friends, family, chosen family, community forums, or even just holding public discussions, whether it be online, whether it be through tweets, whether it be through Twitter spaces or other forms of discussions to expand your understanding of our material conditions. So, with that, also, too, I want to give a disclaimer that if you haven't already noticed, there are many of words that I mispronounce in these readings on this channel. And sometimes I do skip over words because I just don't want to butcher them. But know that it's not done maliciously. It is me trying to read but unable to sometimes pronounce the words for various reasons. So that's why I also encourage people to go and read the books and that the PDFs are free within the Pan African Communist Library on my Twitter page. And that also, too, that if those listening know the correct way to pronounce the words that I'm struggling with, do not hesitate to leave me a message in my inbox on Twitter with a voice note walking me through how to say it. I enjoy learning, and that's the way in which we can help each other. So, with that, I'm going to leave it here and look out for each other, continue to take care of each other, and let's get free.